you actually corrected me because I thought that the electric car was more advanced than the gas powered car. And you had mentioned to me, well, of course, but I remember a conversation about actually before we designed a gas powered vehicle, there was a vehicle that moved by electricity, nothing close to what we have today. But I think most people would get that trivia question wrong. What actually was created first, gas or electric? And electric actually was first.
Yeah, basically back in like 1900, even previous in the late 1800s, the technologies for electric vehicles were innovative. They worked. Right. They worked well. And then it was kind of a battle between the gas-powered and the electric vehicle. And there's a whole history around that. Mm-hmm. Eventually, gas-powered did quite well for obvious reasons. There was oil company involvement as well in the fueling of that. But when you look now and you fast forward, 100 years plus, you actually see correlations almost identical to when gas-powered vehicles disrupted horse and buggy. And this is a lot of people don't quite realize this, but it took about 13 years in New York City to go from predominantly a horse and buggy means of transportation to a vehicle means of transportation. And it took only 2 decades to take the entire United States and convert that. And there's great things to talk about how long it takes for those disruptive innovations to take over. And here we are in the beginning of the second decade. And that's when the fastest growth is of the adoption. So it takes a while.
Beginning of the second decade?
Exactly. In the beginning of that S curve, it takes about a decade to figure it all out. But in that second decade, 80% of that disruption actually happens. And then the last...
So you guys we're way past the tipping point. That's what, 3%?
Yeah, we're effectively in the tipping point. If you want to round the numbers, and depending on who you talk to, Bloomberg or me or others, we're in the tipping point on 2019, 2020. And that means to me, what's the tipping point? Meaning there's really no going back. I mean, you can talk about different definitions of tipping points.
It's like Netflix.
There's no going back.
A lot of people thought, no, that's not going to work out. We're so used to having the disc in our hand, and we got to put it in the machine, and we got to go back and forth. Who's not able to do that? And then all of a sudden, like, well, if it's on my phone and my girlfriend wants to watch something and she just wants to press a button and I don't want to go drive to the place, maybe it's okay. All of a sudden your mentality, you start to get used to things, and then that tipping point becomes the new norm, and then it just gets greater. So you said, I want to make sure I understood this, it took about 100 years for mankind to the evolution of the horse and buggy to gas powered to really become the primary mode of transportation, and it's taken about 20 years. I know electric cars have been out for longer than 20, but to kind of evolutionize what you're doing today.
Yeah, let me clarify a little bit. Horse as a primary means of transportation goes back to ancient years.
Right.
It only took 13 years to flip the horse as a primary means of transportation to the gas-powered vehicle.
I got you.
So that's just in a decade, virtually a little more than a decade.
So that was the like once gas powered became a thing, and people were starting to, what's the word I'm looking for here? Where
adoption.
Yeah, not even the adoption, but just kind of made it more readily available. Because when there's something that's a concept, okay, there's this gas powered vehicle, it's a concept, but it went from concept to something that your neighbor's driving down the street now, and you go, I want one of those. And
what it took was 4 things. Yeah. It took the technology, so Ford. Mm-hmm. It took a manufacturing scale. You couldn't just make these by hand. It took infrastructure. You had to build out the roads, and you had to build out the fueling infrastructure. And then what's interesting, it had to actually take business model innovation. It actually the advent of the car loan. And when you put those 4 convergent concepts together, then you have that massive rush. It's not much different than the digital smartphone.
Right.
As it took out the analog phone, it's not different than the flat panel display, how quickly it took out TV or digital photography, how quickly it made film photography obsolete. These are what's called disruptive innovations. Yeah. Now, when you fast forward to where we are today, the electric vehicle is really dependent on a few things, 2 things mainly. The cost of batteries, because the cost of batteries is directly related to how much distance you'll get out of the vehicle for a price, and the amount of electric vehicle charging infrastructure that's put in place. And that's what Tritium is a world leader in, is in very high-powered DC, very fast charging infrastructure. When you put those two converging technologies together, when you're able to create innovative DC fast charging and deploy those rapidly as infrastructure, that's really first, it's really important. And at the same time, you're seeing battery costs come down to the point where you're almost at cost parity in just a couple of years. You're already at cost parity at the luxury sport class, Tesla versus others. But for the mainstream, you're only a few years and a couple of years away from cost parity. Then it's lights out. I mean, it's game over. There's no more profitability in gas-powered vehicles. And that's why you're seeing all of the car companies and now all the truck companies move very rapidly toward that. Because if they don't, they're frankly going to go out of business.